All right, folks. Hopefully everyone or most of you are back from our little mini break, but we're going to dive into the panel discussion now. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of how this is going to look, I'm dividing it into 3 parts. And so we're going to start with each panelist introducing themselves and giving a brief background on their involvement with UAVs in this industry or in their industry. And then I'm going to have a couple of rounds of questions that I've prepared in advance that are specific to each panelist. And then I have a question too it's the same question, but I want each panelist to answer in turn. So that's going to be the more structured part of the panel. Depending on how long that takes, we may take another short break. That's assuming that that'll be about 60 minutes. Then we'll come back and get to any questions we have from the audience. And I should also add in there, panelists, if you have questions for each other, feel free to bring all of that up, and hopefully we can just have a bit of a dialogue going there. And for the panelists, just, I mentioned this earlier, but we're going to try to limit these answers to around 5 minutes, just so we can get to as much material as possible. And as we've seen already, there's tons and tons and tons to talk about in this area. So we'll do our best to keep moving. But again, I think I don't want this to be too structured, so there will be some conversation involved. And if I do have to interrupt you for time, I really apologize in advance. Hopefully that doesn't have to happen, but anyway. So we are going to let each of the panelists briefly introduce themselves and give a short background for a couple minutes on what they do. So I'd like to start with Don Shinneman. He's the VP of Operations for the Unmanned Safety Institute. And Don, if you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hey, good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Don Shinneman. I've been around the unmanned aircraft space since about 2004. I'm a retired police chief. I represented the International Association of Chiefs of Police on the very first ARC that led to Part 107. I've been a commercial pilot for about 30 years. I'm a current member of the FAA Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team. I've actually worked in the industry now for about 10 years. I work for Boeing Unmanned, Ariane Labs, now FLIR, and presently with the Unmanned Safety Institute. So my talk is going to be about the history of unmanned aircraft regulation. It's now been quite a while since we've worked with regulations, and give you a bit of history there. Okay, Zach?
All right. Sorry, I lost my video there for a second. I think I'm back. Thank you, Dawn. Let's move on to Garrett Seddon, and he's the Unmanned Systems Project Manager for the Center of Excellence. Garrett?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. I am Garrett Seddon, the Unmanned Systems Project Manager for the Colorado Center of Excellence for Advanced Technology Aerial Firefighting. Yes, that is a mouthful. So what we like to tell people is we're the research and development organization for the State Fire Department and the Department of Public Safety. And my role within the COE started about 5 years ago, and trying to introduce and start up the drone program for the Department of Public Safety for wildland firefighters, and CBI, the state troopers, and a few other organizations within the state. And through that, we've developed a training course, etc., that we can talk about later, where we worked with the National Institute of Standards and Technology to develop this course and try to make it a nationwide effort. In conjunction with that, we do a lot of other things at the Center of Excellence. We have a few different project managers that focus on aviation related things, geospatial, and then my projects are all unmanned systems. So unmanned aerial, ground, and UAS detection. So we have a few different projects in those categories of aerial, ground, and UAS detection, and would love any questions and to talk about those later. So, Zach?
Thanks, Garrett. We really appreciate you being here. Let's move on with Mary Wanrad, the owner of Wanrad Civil Engineers. Mary?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I always enjoy participating in this annual event and appreciate the invite. So my name is Mary Wanrad. I am a professional engineer here at Wanrad Civil Engineers. We're an established civil engineering consulting firm located in Broomfield. We primarily do land development projects, but we also do floodplain mapping and just a variety of other civil design projects. And it was probably about 6 years ago when we got started on UAS, and I started researching the potential of this technology, and I thought it was just amazing. And I've been hooked ever since, and we've kind of formed a niche for ourselves. We primarily do very high precision topographic mapping so that we can use that information in our civil engineering design projects. And so it took several months to come up with a workflow that actually involves multiple steps and multiple disciplines. Of course, at the time, you know, no one had written a book about this yet. This is all brand new. As far as I know, we were one of the very first few people in Colorado and probably the country to start developing this technology, using it very specifically for engineering design. And when I say high precision, I mean we're trying to obtain an accuracy of, you know, 1/10 of a foot to maybe 0.25 feet, both horizontally and vertically. And so that takes a lot of surveyed ground control. And so we've been doing that for about 5 years now, or 6 years, I guess. But we started out with photogrammetry and then moved on to LiDAR. So we've had LiDAR capabilities for a while now, which is a completely different workflow, completely different animal. But it does serve other purposes where photogrammetry just doesn't fit the bill when it comes to trying to obtain some real high precision topographic mapping. So that's a brief history of who we are and what our specialty is. And we're just thankful to be a part of the UAS community in Colorado. I think there's no better place to be if you're interested in drones. There's just a lot of talent, a lot of knowledge here, and we're just happy to be a part of it.
Thanks, Mary. We're obviously very glad you could join us today. And finally, Shane Williams. He is the Senior Product and Airspace Analyst for Skyward, which is a Verizon company. Shane?
Thanks, Zach. So first, thanks everybody for letting me hang out today and be part of the panel. I'm super excited to talk. So start my video, I think I did. So yeah, a little bit about me and what I do at Skyward. So I came from an Air Force background, government background. Prior to this job, actually Skyward's the first real job, quote unquote, non-government that I've ever had. Came from a search and rescue background. So all that kind of culminated in me starting to play with drones back in 2013, I think. So I've been using drones for quite a while. I started at Skyward in 2017, and they hired me to make the airspace data that's in our platform really, really good, which I think we've done a pretty good job at. So shortly after that, I transitioned to the product team, where I became the product analyst. And basically my job is to make sure Skyward is amazing for all of our enterprise customers. And so that's what Skyward kind of focuses on, is large enterprise drone operations. So if you have a lot of drones, a lot of pilots, and a lot of complexity, Skyward tries to help you manage all that and stay safe, compliant, and do all that. So, so I have a lot more thoughts on that. So yeah, we want to make sure that Skyward and our platforms meet the needs today, but we're also spending a lot of time looking at the future and what complex operations and all of the techs and all the regulations and all the things that are going to be required to do BVLOS, to do one-to-many, where you have one pilot controlling many drones, which obviously we need a lot of regulation to get there. But Skyward spends a lot of time thinking about that and kind of planning for it and building for that future. So again, great to be here, and I can't wait to get into the discussion.
Thanks, Shane. And thanks to all of you for the introductions. And let's just dive in. So my first question is going to be for you, Dawn. And very generally, I wanted to get your assessment of how this regulatory framework that we've been discussing already is evolving toward the ultimate goal of integrating drones into the national airspace system. And I wanted to talk to you about this because you've been involved in this process in several different capacities, which you touched on in your intro, but you've been involved in the private sector, also as a law enforcement official, but also because you served on the very first FAA rulemaking committee in 2008, and you were involved with drafting what eventually became Part 107. So with all that said, you told me in an email last week when we were preparing for this that in the regulatory scheme, a lot has changed and yet nothing has changed. Could you talk a little bit about this evolution and what you mean by that?
Yep, sure can, Zach. And I'm going to try to share my screen for a very brief PowerPoint presentation, if it manages to work here.
I think we see it, so.
Okay, well, rather than waste time trying to figure this out, the brief history of UAS regulation, how the past impacts the future. I find it in my discussions with folks today who express frustration with the pace of the regulatory environment adapting to what is still relatively new technology. So I think it's valuable to talk about how far we've come and exactly where it began. So it began back in 2004. What was then all military technology started to transition over into civil operations. And in the case of public safety, law enforcement specifically was seen as the first market for drones coming over from the military. So the FAA actually had no idea how to integrate unmanned aircraft operations into the national airspace system. So they applied this order back in 2004, and it was essentially how the FAA was handling military unmanned aircraft operations in the national airspace system. Right around this same time, the FAA began to have monthly conference calls with a group of us representing public safety and some of the manufacturers to discuss ways to integrate UAS. So in 2005, we saw the very first policy statement. They were regulating by policy statement. So 0501 document only addressed public aircraft operations. They would not accept applications for civil operations. And it required the operator, the public agency, to establish airworthiness, required a private pilot written exam, and a third-class medical. None of those things were allowed by statute for public aircraft operations. If you'll take note in the Federal Aviation Regulations, it says pilots of civil aircraft have to have a pilot certificate. Pilots of civil aircraft have to have a medical certificate and so forth. So very early on, we started to have discussions about the ability of the FAA to regulate public aircraft operations. 2006, we see the very first notice published in the Federal Register that spoke to a broader use of unmanned aircraft. And it said for public aircraft, you needed a certificate of authorization. Civil aircraft required airworthiness certification as an experimental aircraft. For recreational users, they used Advisory Circular 9157, which essentially said exercise good judgment. Now, very early on, law enforcement agencies, we tried to use 9157 to operate under, and the FAA quickly came up with a toy versus tool policy. So if you were using it for purely recreational purposes as a toy, you could operate under Advisory Circular 9157. If you were doing anything else, you needed a COA to operate. Several agencies had purchased small unmanned aircraft, normally fixed wing systems back then, and were quickly given cease and desist orders from the FAA to not operate those. So finally, in April of 2008, the historic first Aviation Rulemaking Committee for Unmanned Aircraft. There were 20 of us on that committee representing various unmanned aircraft interests, manufacturers, the Academy of Model Aeronautics. I represented public safety. And we began our work in April of 2008. We submitted our final report actually in April of 2009, a year later. And the process to actually implement that as regulation didn't begin until 2015, 7 years later. The final rule, as most of you know, the final rule was published in the Federal Register on June 28th, 2016, and became effective in August of 2016. And of course, it added Part 107 to the Federal Aviation Regulations that we now operate under. So that's the history of how we got to Part 107. So what hasn't changed? It's written in that 2005 policy. It defines non-cooperative aircraft as aircraft that are not being tracked by air traffic, or an aircraft that does not have an electronic means of identification, i.e. a transponder on board. And then it says, while considerable work is ongoing to develop a certifiable detect, sense, and avoid system, an acceptable solution is many years away. So during the ARC, back in 2008, detect, sense, and avoid was projected to be certified by 2020. 2020 was, of course, last year, and we don't have certified detect, sense, and avoid. The issue is as valid today as it was in 2005. The issue of non-cooperative aircraft and the necessity of UAS to autonomously deconflict remains a primary issue. And now we get into Don's opinion. It's full integration of unmanned aircraft will not happen until certified DSA becomes a reality. The FAA, I think, the culture shift at the FAA from 2005 to now has been remarkable. I think everyone now recognizes that the future of aviation is unmanned. And they've done a great job, I think, of finding ways within the existing regulatory structure and within the limitations of the existing technology to expand the use of UAS without detect, sense, and avoid. But this is really my opinion. I think the regulations have reached the limit of integrating UAS technology as it exists today. I have friends that work in the UAM industry, the advanced air mobility industry, and the way the FAA plans to, at least the discussions at this point, would be to create corridors for them that would essentially be restricted airspace. So it's, again, operating within the existing regulatory framework for the technology. We are not going to see full integration of unmanned aircraft until we get certified to detect, sense, and avoid. And when that actually happens, the next generation of aviation will truly be here. We will be, again, at the next generation of aviation, which will be unmanned. Zach?
Thanks, Don. I really appreciate that. And I know that I basically asked you to summarize, years and years, probably hours and hours of conversation in 5 to 10 minutes. So I really appreciate you
My pleasure.
pull it off. So my next question, sorry folks, I'm just pulling it up on my screen here. I want to go next to Garrett. Garrett, my question for you, in the regulatory discussion, both what's been going on in the United States and even today, a lot of attention seems to be focused on law enforcement initiatives and the role of unmanned systems in this area. But I also want to talk about unmanned systems, the role they're playing in fighting wildfires, which is your specialty. This is becoming an increasingly urgent issue, obviously, in Colorado and for many people in the Western United States. Especially in light of our record-setting wildfire season last year in 2020. So Garrett, with your role with the COE, could you talk a little bit about how drones were used specifically to fight the 2020 wildfire season? And along with that, where do you see the most important advancements being made in this area?
Yeah, thank you, Zach, for that question. So, as everyone knows, last year was a record fire season that kept most of us really busy. And where drones came in there with an addition to other technology, but drones really played a huge factor in a couple different ways. We had long endurance aircraft that would fly during the evenings with different platforms. One of the platforms from Bridger Aeroscope was the Harris L3 Latitude, the FVR 90. And what we would use that for on different fires would be to gain aerial overwatch. So looking for new hotspots that would emerge and mapping those new fire perimeters and providing constant updates to the incident command so they can provide that decision quality data to help them make decisions, where to move fire resources, where to allocate the firefighters on the ground. So that situational awareness from those drones really aided them in making those decisions. And it really augmented our other technology that we have in the state as well as the multi-mission aircraft, the Pilatus aircraft with the MX-15 sensors on there. Those were really busy this year, so those were getting task saturated. So these drones would come in and augment that MMA and provide that critical data to those decision makers on the ground as well. Another area where drones are helping us is aerial ignition. So Drone Amplified created a device that goes on the bottom of a M600 DJI drone. There are a couple other manufacturers out there. Really, the DJI is the only one that they're using that platform or the aerial ignition system with. And what they're doing, how it's currently done, is from a manned helicopter. So they inject glycol into these ping pong shaped balls and then drop them to the ground. And as anyone in aviation knows, fire on a helicopter is never a good idea. And so, they started looking at new ways to do that. It's been a slow process. They've been using it this year and last year heavily. And I don't have the exact statistics from the U.S. Forest Service, but I know one of the pilots, and he said it was nonstop this year, and they did more missions than they ever have. And what they're doing is just dropping those same ping pong balls and doing areas for prescribed burns or fire operations where they're trying to create a area of black or a burned area to prevent the fire from moving in that direction. So it's an attack or offensive attack to try, or defensive, however you want to look at it, to stop that fire from spreading in that direction. It's much safer, it's much more efficient, and it's a lot more cost effective as well. They're pretty interesting devices. They're technical, but it is a area that's really being a force multiplier for aerial ignition and helping the firefighters on the ground be more effective and more importantly, conduct the operation safer. I would say those are the two big areas that drones have really been helping, firefighters fight the wildfires. Other ones are, the little small handheld drones that we're all commonly familiar with, and what the firefighter crews on the ground been doing with the thermal cameras has just been getting quick SA for themselves. So as they're out there fighting fire, one of them carries it in their pack, and they see something that they want to get some eyes in the sky for. They launch one of those thermal cameras up, and they go up there and they're looking for hotspots that are near them to reallocate their own men right out there. And then they also use that information to call back in and let incident command know. So that's a little bit smaller scale, but they are using those handheld units while they're out in the field to impact their decisions and where they're moving as well to fight fire. I think that's it for me for that specific question.
Thanks, Garrett. And actually, just one quick follow-up since I've got spotlight on you. Earlier we touched on this issue of drones interfering with wildfire efforts. Was that an issue in 2020 in Colorado? Did you guys deal with any drones that were getting in the way?
So I think for the state of Colorado, we had one instance where a aircraft stopped aircraft firefighting operations. That was also involved in our UAS detection project that we focused on this last year. That was impacted by COVID, unfortunately, but really the U.S. Forest Service and the campaign in general by the DOI, if you fly, we can't, has been really moving forward. And that public campaign has really shown, efforts moving in the right direction. When the drones first became popular, the numbers being reported were low. Then it went up, and in the last couple years, those numbers are trending down for how many aerial operations are being stopped because of drone incursions into that airspace. I think this last year, only 9 across the United States were affected by, their air operations being shut down because of drones. And it is usually looky-loos, trying to get that shot or, trying to see what's going on. And then there were some incursions this last year, surprisingly, that were more by manned aviation going into those unmanned TFRs that were set up. So there was one in Oregon where they were doing the seed replanting. So if you guys aren't aware, there's drone companies that are going back in after the fire's been through there and planting seeds, trees, etc., to help forest growth. And they were doing their mission, had a TFR up, and a manned aircraft came through there, and they had to issue a SAFECOM. So it's just increasing awareness, not only for unmanned operations, but also with manned aviation, that they're not the only things flying up there anymore. So good question. Thank you for that.
Thank you. And it's encouraging to hear that maybe some progress is being made on the awareness front. So I'd like to hear more about that as well. But for now, let's move on to Mary. Mary, my question for you, as you explained in your introduction, you've been using unmanned systems in your engineering and construction workflows for several years now. The question is really 2 parts. First, have existing regulations, including Part 107, limited your business and your operations, what you perceive that you're able to do? And I'm thinking specifically about beyond visual line of sight, over people at night. And then the follow-up to that is whether you believe that FAA's new rules enabling certain operations over people and at night will lead to any changes to your business and your operations in the short or the long run. So that's a lot, but
I think I got it. So I think the previous regulations, the Part 107 regulations, they really didn't limit us a whole lot. We're primarily, interested in flights over people and flights over moving vehicles. Since we do large scale mapping, we might be flying, a full section, 640 acres. There could be neighborhoods adjacent to that property. There's going to be roads. So we prefer to fly in areas that are, remote locations. We try to stay away from sites that are located downtown. They get a lot more trickier. Takes a lot more coordination to pull those off. We would rather be out, in the rural areas where there isn't a lot of people. There aren't a lot of conflicts. So I think from our perspective, even in doing, mapping, topographic mapping, we don't fly at night. You won't get good results if you're trying to do a collection at night. So night operations beyond line of sight really hasn't affected us either. I mean, even if we're doing a road corridor that's 7 miles long, we'll structure it so that, we never, the plane is never beyond line of sight. So we've kind of developed ways of working with the past and these new current criteria. We have ways of, working with those regulations and staying in compliance, and really to, really hasn't affected our operations a whole lot. In these new regulations, again, I don't really see how it's going to change operations for us significantly. I think I was trying to pay particular attention to what Vic was saying and Kevin, particularly about, hovering over people and flights over people, and how do you define, these public events. Is a construction site considered, a public gathering? Again, we just basically use common sense and try and use, good judgment. And we schedule our flight operations to kind of fit in with off hours. So if I know I'm flying a construction site, I'll probably try and get out there on the weekend when we know there won't be any construction activity. So I don't see that changing a whole lot as far from our perspective.
Okay, and one just quick follow-up on that stuff too, Mary. In your operations so far, have you dealt with any situations where people on the ground are either complaining that there are drones being used, or they're worried about them, or has that aspect come into it all, or have you kind of avoided that?
Yeah, I think for the most part, we've been able to avoid that kind of confrontation. Again, specific because we do a lot of pre-planning. We try and get out there when we know, on a Sunday morning. Sunday mornings are our favorite time because people are sleeping in. So we tend to avoid those types of conflicts.
Seems like a good approach.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mary.
Sure.
Finally, we're going to go to Shane. Shane, here's my question for you. This one, like Mary's, has a couple of parts to it. First, in your role with Skyward, especially dealing with the big enterprise clients, what are the biggest challenges that you run into regarding designing and developing new technologies in the unmanned field, especially considering the regulatory uncertainty that we're all dealing with? So first, that's the first part. The second part, how do you help clients manage this lack of clarity? What do you tell them? What sorts of strategies go into? Obviously, I would imagine a lot of them don't really accept just answers like, well, we don't really know what the law is going to look like in a few years. They need more than that. So what do you tell your clients about the uncertainty, and how big of an obstacle is it right now?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thanks. So what's great about Skyward and Verizon is it's, pretty large organization. So we have a lot of resources. And so we have people that are involved in all of the rulemaking, well, not committees, but they're involved in all the different groups that are advising for the new regulations and stuff. So, so really what Skyward does is for our clients is we focus on those safe and compliant operations. So whatever the rules are today, we help them track their aircraft. We help them basically stay safe with risk management, checklists, all those types of things. And so all we do is explain the rules to them. And if they have an aviation background, it kind of makes our job a lot easier because they already understand the FAA, they understand how aviation rules work. But the ones that don't, we offer, we call it pro services, just consulting for them to get their programs spun up, to teach them what the current rules are. And then we start to lead them into, well, we think the rules are going to do X, Y, or Z. And then we're on top of it pretty much even today, when the new Lance rule came out for night ops. I posted that into our Slack, and half of our team was like, yeah, we're already on it. We're going to talk to our teams next week and get everybody up to speed. So they pretty much know what's happening as soon as it hits. So really, we try to keep them safe and compliant by managing their programs, right? That's what Skyward does. And traditionally, it's been through, like I said, checklists and risk management and tracking all of your things. But what we're getting into even more now is that real-time ability to see where all my drones are operating right now as we speak. And we developed that for our utility customers that want to run huge operations where they might have 5 or 6 drones and a couple of helicopters and a bunch of vehicles all on the ground. And we're able to show them where all of those assets are in real time, right? So they can make sure that everybody's staying safe and staying away from each other, and they just have that situational awareness. So I mean, everything.
I didn't interrupt you there.
Oh, you go ahead.
Go ahead.
So did I hit all of the points? I'm just looking at my notes to see if I missed something. Yeah, I think that's it for me, unless you have a follow-up.
Yeah, well, I was just going to mention what you talked about, the situational awareness issue with emerging technology. That seems to me that's going to be one of the biggest questions for the commercial viability of a lot of these operations, right? Because these companies need to scale up to a massive level, so they're not having individual operators. So how are your customers facing that issue?
So today, everybody's operating just visual line of sight because that's what the rules are. And so, so for now, we basically just show them that situational awareness of where their aircraft are right now. In the future, we look forward to things like remote ID and advanced remote ID when we get into being able to see all of the aircraft around, both manned and unmanned. And Garrett was talking about the surveillance and being able to drone detection. So Garrett, I'd love to talk to you about that, because that's something that Skyward and Verizon are focusing pretty heavily on. Like, how can we provide that true situational awareness and really real-time information to our pilots so that we can start to enable beyond visual line of sight, which, as we all know, is requires some pretty heavy waivers today. But you're right, in order to scale, in order to get there, we're going to need to be able to provide that detect, sense, and avoid pretty much across the entire platform. And not just if you're flying with Skyward, if you're flying with any other provider, we all need to see each other. And I think the current remote ID is a great start to that. And I think Skyward, we look forward to that expanding and figuring out really how we can scale that up.
Awesome, thanks, Shane. So looking at the time, I think we've got time for one more round of a question for each panelist. And I have the same question for all four of you, but I'd like to hear your answers in turn on this. So we'll just go in the same order. And the question is pretty wide open, but here it is. So looking 5 years into the future, what is your most optimistic and your most realistic expectation of how drones are going to be used in your field? So you can go a lot of different ways at that, but I'm curious to see what you have to say. Don, if you don't mind, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, since I've watched this from the very beginning, and not to sound like a broken record, but it's all going to depend on detect, sense, and avoid. I think the FAA will continue to find ways to integrate unmanned aircraft into the national airspace system, and without it until we get there. In my time with Boeing Unmanned, and having conversations about the future of the unmanned aviation world, Boeing Commercial's opinion was that in the 2020s, the air cargo haulers would no longer have human pilots on board. They would be completely unmanned. And I don't know if any of you who follow the regulatory world, but the regulatory process has started to reduce the minimum crew on air cargo haulers to one person, who will essentially be a systems monitor. So to answer your question specifically, 5 years from now, I see us, depending on the ability for the technology to advance, I see amazing things happening in the role that unmanned aircraft will play in many facets of transportation, whether it's passenger liners, air cargo haulers, smalls for utility projects. I see great things happening in the next 5 years, but with the only limitation being the technology and the pace that it takes to change regulations, as evidenced by 2009 to 2016 to get Part 107 actually made into regulation.
Well, and not to put you on the spot here, but would that be what you consider your expectation or your hope? And what would be the difference between, best case scenario and if you put money on it 5 years from now?
Best case scenario is we have certified detect, sense, and avoid technology. My hope and also my expectation that we will have that And then we'll be moving into full integration of unmanned aircraft, and again, ushering in the whole next generation of aviation.
Okay, thank you. Garrett, how about your perspective on this?
Thank you. So great question. I echo Don's comments as well. I just read an article the other day that was highlighting the fact of, Air Uber style coming on board by, mid this decade, and hopefully it's, in full motion by the end of this decade. So where we see that moving forward for us is making sure that any platform that we have helicopter wise is adaptable for the unmanned system. So you guys may have seen that we recently signed some legislation for the state of Colorado to purchase a Firehawk. What we're trying to do for the state of Colorado, always looking forward at new and emerging technology, is making sure that platform is capable of being unmanned in the future. There's a lot of roadblocks and hurdles that we have to get through, but we want to make sure that we invest correctly and make sure we put the appropriate technology into that. So when we do move forward, and as what Don was saying with the detect, sense, and avoid, that we are ready for that, and we can apply that technology to our current our equipment and continue to move forward. So that's the most realistic option we're looking at, is hopefully the regulations keep moving forward. Our hope is that one day we can do unmanned flight operations, where the helicopter goes and dips a Bambi bucket into the water or a snorkel into the water, picks it up during the night, and then goes and drops that water on a fire. So that's our hope for large unmanned systems.
Okay, thanks, Garrett. And yeah, I mean, I guess certainly not within 5 years, but the goal ultimately could be unmanned systems would be able to detect heat in the forest and put these fires out before humans even know about them. Right?
That is true. There are satellites that are already doing that for us. So that is one of the other projects we have, where we're using satellites to help us do that detection as well.
Okay. Mary, what about you? 5 years in the future, what do you hope to see, and what do you think you'll see?
Well, I hate to be redundant, but I would agree with Don as well, that I think, realistically, in 5 years, we'll have some sense and detection capability, which would be a huge benefit to everyone involved. I'm hoping also that we have advances in technology, particularly, we're interested more in the LiDAR sensors and scanners. There's talk of solid state LiDAR units, which are lighter. Endurance is a big thing for us. The more endurance we have, the better off we're going to be, the longer we can stay in the air, the larger areas that we can map at one time. So advances in technology as far as batteries, I think better sensors, all those are moving forward, and I can see those developing in the next 5 years or so. So those are, we have that to look forward to. Because again, we're just always looking for more endurance. We want to stay in the air longer to be a little more cost effective. I think is optimistic, from an optimistic perspective. I don't know, we keep hearing about, Amazon and some of these other companies, trying to get to the point where they're going to be able to deliver packages with drones. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I just don't see that happening anytime soon. Primarily because of the sense and detect capabilities, and the current FAA rules about not flying over people and moving vehicles. I'm not sure how that could even happen in the next 5 years. They're making advances and they're working on the technology, but I think that's a little further down the road.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with you on that, Mary. And so, all right, let's go to Shane and your feedback on this as well. What do you think, Shane?
Yeah, so first, just to echo what everybody else has said, I think the advanced sensors and advanced aircraft, that's going to continue to leap forward and probably continue to outpace regulation. So optimistically, I would love to see drones fully integrated into the NAS in 5 years with UTM, right, Universal Traffic Management, so everybody can see everybody and everything's happy. Specific BV loss would be approved. We can get to our one-to-many, one pilot to a bunch of drones, just doing whatever job they need to do, right? That's optimistic. Realistically, I hope that we see a few BV loss corridors, you know, maybe over larger areas or large cities that kind of have that UTM deployed in those smaller, large BV loss areas, but not nationwide, so that we can start to basically build the safety case, right? To prove to the FAA that, yeah, we can actually build a corridor where we can do BV loss operations and not run into things and keep that safety record where it needs to be. So realistically, I see that happening in the next 5 years, hopefully sooner than the next 5 years, but we'll keep working on it, right?
Okay. And this is just a little follow-up for all four of you. If anyone has any thoughts, you know, if you think about 10 years ago where we were and what we were talking about for 2021, do you think 10 years ago you would be very disappointed if you learned that this is what we're talking about at our conference in 2021?
I think most of us are disappointed over the last 3 or 4 years. Things, right? It's just, it goes slower than anybody wants it to. Again, the tech is there. It just hasn't been proven yet. And we have to get to that, what is it, nine nines of safety. We have to prove that it can be safe. And that's the part that I think, because we're disappointed is we haven't been able to prove that yet. So the regs are not there yet.
Yeah, that 10 to the minus ninth power is an interesting number. When we were getting our initial instructions as part of the ARC, being able to develop a safety case for what we were going to propose, that was the number that we were given, 10 to the minus ninth power. We had to prove that nothing bad would happen to that degree. You know, that's a pretty difficult goal to achieve.
And some of that plays into the public acceptance standpoint too. It's a very low risk tolerance for this technology right now. So I think that's part of this challenge, in my opinion. All right, so looking at the time here, everyone, 11:32. So we were scheduled for a break right around 11:45, just to take 10 minutes. If you guys want, we have about 10 minutes. I do have one more question for each of you, but we're going to have to do somewhat even more abbreviated answers. So this next question, if you could even give me just a 1 to 2 minute response on your thoughts. So we'll just kind of run through these. And Don, we'll start with you again. And this question is about law enforcement and your background. You were chief of police for 12 years, I believe.
Yes.
Given this background, would you explain why remote ID is so important for the law enforcement field? And as written, do you believe remote ID accomplishes the goals that it was set out to accomplish? And what shortfalls, if any, do you see in the existing regulation?
Well, the primary shortfall is a local law enforcement officer has no authority to enforce the federal aviation regulations. Problem we've had with the FAA very early on, who, to quote them, said it was the role of the local constabulary to control the flight of drones. We have no authority to do that. The FARs give us the authority, or give local law enforcement officers the authority to demand to see the airman certificate and photo ID. But unless there's a state or local ordinance that they can enforce, there's really no action that they can take with regard to drones. And I know the FAA guy was discussing federal preemption and those kinds of things. So the expectation that this is going to give law enforcement powers to control the use of drones is really a misnomer. It's not going to happen. And in the current environment, this is not on the radar of most law enforcement officers. Never has been.
And very briefly, how does that get addressed in your opinion? How do we fix this?
I'm not a scholar on the enforcement of federal laws. In my days as a police officer, if you arrested somebody for bank robbery, that was a state crime. The FBI came in and charged them with an actual federal crime of robbing a federally insured facility. So I'm not sure what the answer there is, especially given that federal preemption. They control, once it leaves the ground, that's controlled by the FAA. Some states have state statutes for careless and reckless operation of aircraft that may apply. Most don't. There's question about whether or not that's federally preempted. What I've seen most effective is the ability of state and local governments to control the takeoff and landing operation. So they can pass, that's okay. They can pass state ordinances, statutes and ordinances for that gives law enforcement something to enforce. But once it leaves the ground, it's in the NAS and beyond the control of law enforcement officers.
Yeah, that's a difficult conundrum that needs to get figured out somehow going forward. I agree. And by the way, just a general comment for the audience, please feel free to submit questions. We don't have too many, well, we don't have any right now. And so we, anything you'd like to ask these panelists, this is your time to do it. So anyway, please get those going. All right, Mary, one more short question for you.
Sure.
Are there, oh, and you know what, I'm sorry, I'm going down my list here, and Garrett, I'll go with you first. Again, from a wildfire suppression standpoint, and you've talked a little bit about this with the drone technology, where are the major limitations that you see with technology right now? If you could dictate where the technology is going to go in the short term, what would help the most for fighting fires?
As far as technology goes, I mean, I think it's been stated before. I think Mary mentioned it, improving the battery life, for some of those smaller drones and for some of the heavy lift drones that we would like to utilize. Other than that, it's kind of more regulatory. Shane mentioned there that, the tech is there, and we agree that the tech is there. It's just in the regulatory scope, we're not allowed to use it. And then as far as the feds go, you have to get your aircraft typed and your pilots typed. And so, getting that training, and with the current foreign drone ban, in place, it's really challenging to get new firefighters trained so they can actually use this technology out on a fire. It is also hard to use the most affordable technology out there to, increase safety and efficiency of our firefighters. So as far as tech, I don't think there's a huge limitation there. More than anything, it's, regulations and bills that are being passed that are inhibiting our abilities to use this tool effectively.
Okay. Mary, going to you, a question that I have for you is, you started in, I think, using drones in 2015, you said?
Yes, that's right.
For your business. How, if at all, has your thinking on this, on the use of drones and the application in your business, how has it changed since you started using them? Or were there any doubts you had in the beginning that you don't have anymore? Are there doubts you have now that you didn't have in 2015?
No, I think I'm just as enthusiastic today about the technology as I ever have been, since the beginning. I just think it's especially for engineering, it has so many benefits to society. And so the applications just seem limitless. And I'm just enthusiastic about, promoting the technology. I think it's going to do great things for our society. There are plenty of benefits. I think it's just going to take some time to, for the FAA regulations to keep pace with technology. It's going to be constantly changing. I think we all know that. Maybe it's not moving as quickly as we had hoped, but I understand we do need to be cautious. I do have a private pilot certificate as well. I'm not current, but I at least understand, the potential conflicts between manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft and, how careful we have to be. And I think transponders, having transponders or some kind of remote ID on the drones is a great idea. I think that's long overdue. That's, again, hopefully going to evolve in the next 5 years. I think it's essential for meshing the unmanned aircrafts with manned aircraft. And so, that we're avoiding any potential conflicts.
Okay, thanks. And finally, Shane, question for you. You have described your role with Skyward as reducing friction with enterprise drone operations. And you touched on some of this already, but what do you see are the biggest sources of friction with your clients right now in these operations? And how do you fix those?
Yeah, another great question. Right, so all of our customers, whether they're in construction, utilities, telecom, whatever their use case is, they have a job they need to get done. And the drone helps them, hopefully, helps them get that job done. But using a drone, if you're not aviation oriented, right, all of the rules and all of the tracking and all the things that go into that safe, compliant operation, that's what we do, is we try to reduce the friction and just make it as easy as possible to turn the drone from more of an aircraft that you have to be specially trained and have years and years of experience into something that's more of a tool, right? It's a tool on the truck, just like any tool just like a hammer, maybe not a hammer, but just another tool that we can use. So pop the tool out, get the tool in the air, and do the job that I need to do. And actually, from the Verizon perspective, right? Verizon uses drones quite a lot to inspect cell towers and to do that type of work. And we're working very hard with our Verizon partners, a couple that are actually in our attendee list today, to, right, how can we make it as quick and safe as possible to arrive on site, get the drone out, do the job we need to do, get it logged, keep track of the maintenance, like all of the things that go into that aircraft and the NAS, and keep it safe, keep it compliant, and just get your job done. So really, we kind of go from a jobs to be done perspective of whatever my job to be done is with that drone, use the drone to get that job done as quickly as possible. So,
okay, yeah, no, I mean it's helpful to hear it in sort of simplified terms, I guess, right, for the approach and problem solving at some level.
And yet the regulations are quite complex, and if you don't follow the regulations properly, there's some pretty big potential impacts, especially when you're an enterprise company and you're risk averse. So the lawyers at these big companies really they really control what you can do with your drones. So
right, especially when a lot of the answers have to do with, well, I don't really know, we're not sure, and
yeah, that's not a good answer for lawyers, right?
Okay, thanks. And guys, with that, it is just about 11:45, so we're going to just take another 5 or 10 minutes, or anyone needs to get up, move around, and we'll come back, get to every audience question that we have. And along with that, I mentioned this, but to the panelists, if you have things you want to bring up, this is going to be your time after the break, issues that we haven't touched on, things you want to expand on, questions for the other panelists, whatever, questions for the audience. Let's think of anything like that you want to get to, and we will see everyone on the other side. Let's go about 5 till noon, so 11:55. We'll come back.